Evening, everyone. Welcome to the Astronomical Society of Edinburgh. If there's any visitors here, don't know if there are or not, but welcome anyway, if you're here or online on Zoom or YouTube. If you're on online, then you're probably better off than coming into a horrible wet Edinburgh. Okay, this is what's coming up tonight. My name is Mark Phillips. I'm the president of the Society. I've got a few news items, what talks we've got coming up soon. And then a main event of the evening is we have Dr. Rebekah Higgitt telling us about the Ilay Dial and Archibald Campbell, the Earl of Ilay, the Duke of Argyll. Should be interesting. And then we have Jim Nisbet, who's going to tell us about the sky in December. We have a couple of new members already this month. It's actually December, not November. Paul Ferretti and Daniel Arnold. I don't think either, well, Paul won't be here because he's in America, so he's definitely not going to be here, but maybe they're online, so can we welcome our new members, please? And we're now at 206. While I'm talking about Dan there, Dan, one of our newest members, is also the driving force behind this Doulton Solar Walk, and a number of our members were actually at that today for the official launch, and Martin Whitfield, the MSP, was there to launch that as well. It's a really good thing, a scale model of the solar system that you can walk around from Doulton to Archibald with stops along the way with QR codes and lots of information about it as well, and that's the launch today. We are happy to support that and promote it as much as we can. It's a really good thing. Any of our members who've been there have really enjoyed it and think it's a very worthwhile thing. The backdrop I'm using is this picture by Eros Tang of the Wizard Nebula. We've actually been imaging this in Spain at the moment, but Eros, who is a wizard at imaging, has done this from Edinburgh. He spends a long time on each of the objects and has some amazing skills and produces something which is easily as good as the stuff we get in Spain, and that's from the centre of Edinburgh, or at least he says it is, as we know. Speaking of Spain, we are back up and running at last. Our two Omegon cameras both failed, and they have been repaired and returned to us. We did actually not know when the cameras were coming back. Omegon wouldn't tell us when that was going to be, so we ended up buying a spare camera to keep us going. But as you can imagine, as soon as we got the spare camera, the old cameras came back. So we have sent the new camera back and get a refund on that. But we are already taking pictures and gathering data again. So as the Wizard Nebula is taken in Spain, we've been doing the comets that we've been following for a while, and you've got M81 there as well. So it's really good to be working again in Spain, although the weather there is, and that is the weather today, and it has been for the last few days, and looking like it will be like that for the next few days as well. So it's just like here, really. Just 4,000 feet up a mountain, though, so it's not surprising. This item caught my attention in the news. Voyager 1, which is the furthest human-made object in space, launched 47 years ago, is working again. You may have heard that it had stopped communicating, but it is now communicating again. And it's 15,000 million miles away from Earth. That's 23 light hours. The reason it caught my attention is because a few of us have been imaging Jupiter at the moment, because it's nice and high in the sky. And this was the first Voyager close-up of Jupiter on its way there, which at the time I'm sure people were jumping up and down in amazement at. But one of our members, Ron Morley in Fife, didn't go as far, managed to take that with an amazing amount of detail as well. So it's just an indication of how much the technology, the techniques have moved on. I think Ron was probably launched more than 47 years ago, though, so he's a bit older. And just for a bit of comparison there, that's what the 200-inch telescope on Palomar was doing in 1952. So I think Ron wins that round, definitely. And looking in our own archives, one of our former presidents, CFO Smith, in about 1940, drew that picture of Jupiter. That's probably using the 6-inch Cooke telescope on Carlton Hill. But yeah, Ron definitely wins that one. Okay, coming up over the next few months, we have our Imaging Observing Group on Wednesday, and that's for ASE members, and that'll be on Zoom as usual. On the 20th of December, we've got Professor Martin Hendry telling us about gravitational wave astronomy. This is something we've had lined up for a while, but has been cancelled on 2 occasions actually for various reasons. But it is a good talk that I've seen Martin talk about that before, and it will be really, really good, really interesting. In January, we're having our Imaging and Observing Group meeting first because we're having our first meeting on the 10th of January rather than the 3rd. So that'll be on the 8th. And on the 10th of January here again, and on Zoom and online, we'll have Professor Colin Snodgrass telling us about NASA's DART mission and the results of that. So that's it from me. So I'm going to hand over to Rebekah now. She'll tell you about this fascinating historic artifact. Which you didn't bring with you.
Is my microphone working? Yes, good. So some of you may have heard a talk I did online, I think, back early when I'd moved back up to Edinburgh, that was on the Transit of Venus expedition to Hawaii that included an astronomer who'd been based at the Royal Observatory on Carton Hill. I realised this would have been really good timing to have done that talk now, because we are just about to come up to the 100th and 50th anniversary of that event. But I've already done that talk, so I won't be giving you that one. And I'll be moving back further in time and talking about this object, which has been recently acquired at National Museum Scotland, which I hope will be of some interest. I'll be talking about it, its maker a bit, and particularly about Archibald Campbell, who was Earl of Ilay and 3rd Duke of Argyll. So yes, we'll be thinking a bit about London as well as Scotland. We'll be thinking about London instrument makers in the 18th century. We'll also be thinking a little bit about politics. So I hope not to get too far away from astronomy and bring it back to you, but it's about the wider context that astronomy existed in, I guess, in the 18th century. So this is some other pictures of this wonderful dial. Its number is T2023.20, which reminds me that it was acquired in 2023, although it only went on display earlier this year. It was an object that the museum, National Museum Scotland, and also its predecessor institution, Royal Scottish Museum, have tried to acquire before. So it was quite a triumph to be able to successfully fundraise and then also successfully acquire it when we did. It is the 3rd time we've tried. We tried in 1969, we tried in 1999, and we tried again in 2023, and a 3rd time was lucky. So I'm very pleased to be able to do it for the museum generally, and also for my predecessor, Alison Morrison-Lowe, who some of you may know, who did an awful lot of work to try and acquire it back in 1999, and whose work on the instrument and the collection that it was associated with has also been very helpful in thinking about it. So this is bigger than you probably think. You'll have to go and see it. But it is a standing equinoctial ring dial. It was one of a relatively new type for the period early in the 18th century. And it has this clock dial on the top, but it is absolutely not a clock. It is a sundial. The clock, the dial there is just an indicator. It shows the hours. It allows you to read it off on that 24-hour dial. But the important parts are the circles. It is universal, so you can set it to any latitude. And you can adjust for the date, the time of year, so where the sun will be. You can adjust it there's a compass, obviously, so you can get your orientation right, make sure you're facing where the sun will be passing across your horizon. And it can also be adjusted for magnetic declination. So if you're adjusting it by compass, you then want to know what your magnetic the difference between your magnetic and your astronomical north are to make sure you're getting it very accurate. And then you revolve that whole central equator dial over the course of the day, and that would track the sun and allow you to read it both on the central ring part of the dial or on that indicator at the top. We can say more about it if that wasn't completely clear. But it is a dial that's also a little bit like an armillary sphere. So you think sundial, you think of a flat plate normally, sort of, on a wall maybe, a garden ornament that has a projection that's basically works in one location. This is more like a little model of your celestial sphere. So it allows you can use it anyway, you can adjust it appropriately. You can think about, the Earth being in the center and the sun effectively revolving around that. The dial was made by Richard Glynn from London, who was an instrument maker with those dates. London, of course, at this period, beginning of the 18th century, is just beginning to make its mark as a real centre for scientific instrument making. You've got some really important figures beginning. It's starting to get a name in comparison to other centres of production. Earlier, you have Germany, places like Nuremberg were really important in an earlier period, France, Paris very much as well, but London, and particularly around where Glynn was based, and you might not be able to read that advertisement, but he says he's at the Hercules and Atlas, so that's his sign, in Fleet Street facing Salisbury Court. So around Fleet Street at this period, there's a real confluence of instrument makers and globe makers and map makers and so on beginning to develop that are gaining a reputation that means that their products are bought all over the world. People will come from Paris and other places to shop in London for instruments if they're the right kind of individual. Not saying everyone does. So again, you might not be able to read this advertisement, but it says, it's interesting. It tells us a lot about the instrument making craft at this period, which is that they're diversifying their market. They're trying to reach a range of people who will buy their products. So he talks about how he makes all sorts of mathematical instruments, either for land or sea, according to the newest improvements. So he's saying, these are instruments for surveying, leveling, things for navigation, finding the time, those very practical kind of instruments. But then he says also that, so charts, etc. are mentioned, but also that he makes instruments in gold, silver, brass, or ivory that are relevant for experimental philosophy. So this, this advertisement is, I think 1720, something like that. This is, beginning of a sort of public world for something called experimental philosophy. Glynn is actually, I think, the first written example we have of an instrument maker who specifically says he makes philosophical instruments as opposed to mathematical or optical. So he's buying into that new world of experimental philosophy that's just coming around in London at this period. So he's also saying he sells things like telescopes, but also air pumps and things like this dial, which is clearly not a practical dial, I need to know the time, generally. It is a bit fancier than that. It is a show-off piece that says a lot about who you are, what you know, and how astronomy and time and Earth all relate to each other. So this is just a quick map to put you in the scene. We've got St. Paul's Cathedral over there. That's a real centre for the print trade. Glynn himself, his first recorded shop was in Cheapside, which is on the other side of St. Paul's, so in the City of London. He then moves out to Fleet Street, which is technically outside the old walls of London, but this is the direction that fashionable London is moving, westwards towards Westminster. Those dots, so here's the circle there, so opposite Salisbury Court. There are a couple of dots there that represent some other important makers who were working around there at the same time, people like John Senex, who made globes and charts in the period, and he certainly worked with him. Thomas Wright, I think, was there as well. The blue dot nearest me is Crane Court, which is where the Royal Society was at the time. That was another address for Thomas Wright, who is a maker that, again, we can find links in terms of the kinds of instruments that are made, relationships sort of as businesses are taken over and so on. The one, let's try and remind myself which one's there. Thomas Rowley, Johnson Court, that's the next one along. Rowley is was an important maker. He made instruments, again, very practical ones for the Board of Ordnance, for example, for government and so on, but also he was a master of mechanics to the king, so he was close to the court, and he's the person that we associate with making the original orrery for the Earl of Orrery, so that model of planetary motion. Rowley is definitely influential. He probably made similar dials to the one that you saw earlier by Glyn. So there's definitely a connection in terms of the manufacture going on between them. So he's also very close to Crane Court, where we find William Dean, another ordnance maker, but again, he's associating with philosophers at the Royal Society as well. The dot that you come to on the lower side, the corner of Water Lane, is where you would find Thomas Tompion, who's a clockmaker, who then partnered with George Graham, who is perhaps known to fans of astronomy as someone who made astronomical instruments as well as astronomical regulators, so really top quality clocks and regulators for astronomy. So there are links we can find. Glyn himself, although he mostly made what we call mathematical instruments, ones with essentially scales on them one way or another. He was a clockmaker in terms of his guild. So he was made free of the Clockmakers' Company after having been apprenticed to a clockmaker in 1707, was able to set up business partly through family connections. He married the daughter of some globe and map makers, went into business probably with the mother, the widow of that map maker, so he sort of got an entry that way. So he has links to clocks, and he has links to globes, and he has links to mathematical instrument making. And I think his instruments really give us that sense of going beyond, say, a straight rule and thinking about how, you know, that sort of reaches, you know, the celestial sphere beyond that. A couple of other examples of Glyn's work. Here, one from Oxford. I don't think we know who that was made for. This armillary orrery, again, it's big. And again, combines that sense of armillary sphere, the celestial sphere, with the idea of planetary motion. So you've got a little orrery set within it. And again, a indicator dial on the top. The next one I was delighted to go and see at Chatsworth House was a very similar kind of dial. Again, we have a standing equinoctial ring dial, so the same type as the one that we've acquired, and in silver. So it is really exquisite, but it's considerably smaller than the one we have. The one we have is big, impressive bling, but this one is really lovely and made, of course, for a very important customer, the Duke of Devonshire, who was William Cavendish, second Duke of Devonshire, very wealthy landowner, a peer, a Whig politician. And there are other examples like this, not in silver, but a similar size to this, smaller than our one, which are now, although I've not had the chance to go and see them, in the Forbidden City in Beijing and at the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. So being made for Tsars and emperors and things like that. These are real status pieces. So who was our one made for? It is also has a connection in its physical nature that we're able to read, fortunately. On the top of it is this heraldry, and that is for the Earl of Ilay. And there only was one ever Earl of Ilay, which was Archibald Campbell. So we were able to make a very close and easy identification, which is great news, because it's not always possible to know when an instrument turns up who's had it in the past. And also, just to seal the deal, the central plate of the dial has the Earl's crown on it and a monogram AC for Archibald Campbell, which is readable, you know, both sides, back to front, either way. So this, as I say, is now on display. So if you want to hop along the road when it's open to the newer part of the National Museum of Scotland building, the Scotland Galleries. It's on level 3 there at the area called Scotland Transformed. So it begins the story of the active union. And the gallery it's in is called Spirit of the Age, and tells the story of what we might call the Enlightenment. Because that is a story that both the instrument and astronomy as, you know, this kind of new experimental philosophy, public world is part of, and its owner, very much so. And it's a Scottish story because he was a Scottish peer, obviously being a Campbell and an Argyll. So there's a little bit of a rundown of some of his dates and some of the many, many positions that he held and some of the things that he was interested in. He was very key with his brother. So early days, the two of them very much worked together. His brother was the second Duke of Argyll. Their father had died earlier. And they are key to the Act of Union itself passing. They're obviously key within their areas of influence in Scotland. There's the development of the Argylethian, as they call it, faction of Scottish politics and then British politics after that. And they work after the Act of Union very much with the Whig government, with Walpole when he was Prime Minister, with the Hanoverian succession as it came in. They were both soldiers at different times, particularly the second Duke, but Archibald, the younger brother, is also involved, for example, in the 1715 Jacobite Rising and suppressing that. But mainly what he's known for is politicking, being able to gain influence, gain favours for family and friends, but also to put people that he liked, not just family, very much about keeping their interest alive, but also people that he felt could do a good job and putting them in positions of influence. He was principal manager of Scottish politics between sort of 1725 and 42, and then a period where he was out of favour, and then again 1747 until his death in 1761. So you might be more familiar with Viscount Melville, Dundas, that figure on the enormous column in St Andrew's Square, as being, a key figure for managing Scottish affairs, essentially, with the government in Westminster, and then exercising really quite significant power in Scotland. Islay, as he was until he became Duke of Argyll in 1743, really was that figure in the earlier part of the century, but he's somewhat less well known, I would say. He was then also very much an improver. He was interested in trying to, get things working for Scotland, not just for his immediate benefit and his faction, but also this sense of developing Scotland and keeping it somewhat independent. So he's very much pro-union, and Scotland was meant to be part of the union. It was meant to gain from being part of the union. And he sort of made sure it was also partly independent as well. So we obviously have the retained institutions of church and law and so on, and he was very much a Scottish lawyer trained. Those things were not amalgamated. So you have this kind of union, but somewhat independent and separate as well. He was an investor in all sorts of things, again, for personal benefit, but also in order to, he saw those two things the same. He does well, the nation does well, because he's encouraging trade, he's improving agriculture, he's improving his land, he's improving Scotland. He was founder director of Royal Bank of Scotland, British Linen Bank, and the linen trade. Those things, again, very much connected in terms of encouraging investment, encouraging other landowners to invest as well. And he had enormous powers of patronage because he held essentially the crown patronage in Scotland. He was able to put people into military positions, into legal positions, into church positions, into also academic positions, which is one of the places where he has significant influence, and one of the reasons why some people have called him a sort of grandfather of the Scottish Enlightenment because of that. Not always done directly. Sometimes he's using, his agents and other people within his family to do it. So sometimes that influence is happening at a remove. But nevertheless, there is an extent to which his interests, his view of the world, shapes what happens in Scotland. Just say, there was, I think, mention in one of his obituaries that when he died, his engraved portrait was the most owned engraving in Scotland at the time, which is a slightly odd thing to say. But I think the indication was, he was important. People knew who he was. He had quite a, significant state funeral sort of being carried around Scotland before he was buried. But I should say, for a period, his portrait engraved was also very widely owned in Scotland because he appeared on our banknotes. If you have a £1 note or a £100 note, he still appears on it because those haven't been updated to the polymer series. But otherwise, those notes are clearly out of use. But we know his image from that. And that's because he was a first director of the Royal Bank of Scotland as one of its founders. So he's particularly known as a politician, somewhat conniving, perhaps his enemies might have thought, self-interested, they might have thought, other friends saw it rather differently. But he's also known as this kind of Enlightenment improver kind. That's nicely illustrated. So this is where that image I showed earlier of his coat of arms comes from this book, which is about the interest of Scotland considered, that is addressed to him because he is the person who's ensured that Scotland's got some interest and some funding associated with a new commission for fisheries and agriculture. So that's the kind of thing that he is making politics work for Scotland through the linen industry, all of that kind of thing. I love this frontispiece. It's so moralizing as well as sort of improving. It's got an anthill, a beehive, and a spider's web among the images of, good ploughing and good husbandry and all the rest of it. So this is, everyone is meant to be improving themselves as well as improving their land and improving the nation. And Ilay certainly did that in a very personal sense. He had his own estates in England. He had Witton, which was near sort of Richmond, Kew, that sort of area. In Scotland, he bought something called the Whim. Well, it got named. It was a bog, essentially. But his challenge to himself was, I buy something that looks this bad. Can I make it work as agriculture? So it was an experimental estate that he acquired. And he was very interested in horticulture. And he is known for introducing trees, particularly, lots of exotic species of trees. So that's one area that, beyond the immediate politics and improvement, he's very known for. This is an engraving from when Horace Walpole's memoirs were published, but he had created that drawing before, when in the 1760s, so after Ilay or Argyll had died, but within memory. And he thought that his father, Robert Walpole, although Ilay and Walpole had been very close for a period, in the end he blamed Ilay for Walpole's loss of power. So he talked about intrigue, and he called him slovenly and revengeful and artful and all of these kinds of things. But he said, Argyll has risen to supreme authority in Scotland, so he talks about that. He also talks about his planting, his encouraging of planting in England as well as Scotland. He talks about the exotics. He says he contributed essentially to the richness of colouring so peculiar to our modern landscape. So there's a real sort of imprint on the world around people as a result of Ilay's interest in trees in particular. But he also says, he admits somewhat grudgingly that in his private life he had more merit. He had a great thirst for books, he said, a head admirably turned to mechanics, was a patron of ingenious men, and a promoter of discoveries. And you note that he's got some instruments on that image. So there are the trees, there is some sort of Scottish textiles, there is a sword for the soldier. His brother became master of the ordnance as well. But then you've got a globe and a set square and some dividers, so those classical kind of mathematical instruments as well. So that's something he is absolutely known for. If you want to know more about Ilay, this is the book to read. His biographer, Roger Emerson, and some of the other articles that he's written give much, much more detail about his interests, his patronage, his interest in schemes of improvement, projection, all of that kind of thing, his being a master in mathematics, and just enjoying the company of people who could talk mathematics or people who were practical and hands-on. So he would have dinner with, the politicians he needed to, but what he really enjoyed was people his own kind of age with his own interests who were practical, pragmatic people that he could, have a chat about tools and clocks with. That's what he really enjoyed in his spare time when he had it. And we know that he knew and had to dinner, people like James Bradley, who was Astronomer Royal, James Short, the telescope maker, Scottish, of course, as well, instrument makers like George Adams, the Earl of Morton, who was president of the Royal Society. People like that were allies and just people he enjoyed. Physicians, gardeners, architects, and so on. People like that who he felt were intelligent and interesting and on his level. So these were the kind of people, as well as others that would come to his house. This is a plan of his house in London, and that was the real centre of power, essentially. This is a plan of Argyle House. So that's just at the corner of Oxford Street and Regent Street now, in that area. His brother and he were both occupying that from 1706, Ilay from 1711, and new houses were built for both of them in the 1730s. Ilay's was known as the library from the very beginning. He had so many books there that friends and acquaintances called the whole house the library. But in the 1740s, he then also added a library, which is that large structure. So there's a bit of garden, and then below that, that is the library. It's kind of bigger than the house itself. It's 2 stories. And then there were other rooms off that. And we know there were scientific instruments in there. And there were mathematical texts by the very, very many. Curiosities, natural history, all of that kind of thing as well. But to quote Emerson, says, "The magnificence of Ilay's collection of mathematical books is astonishing, even when one remembers that he and his brother were said to be competent mathematicians." It goes above and beyond. He had practical books he kept up to date. He would buy new editions. He had several editions of Newton's works and popularizations of Newton's works. He had 13 editions of Euclid, because why have just one when you can have 13, etc., etc. And he had lots of books just on instruments. He was really, really interested in how they worked and in patronizing the people who were publishing those books and making the instruments. He also had libraries in all of his other properties, and he had instruments in all of his other properties as well. So this is Witton, the one that's near sort of Ham House, Richmond, that kind of area. And for this one, a visitor said that on each side of the great room below the stairs is a long gallery, in one of which are all the instruments which the Duke used in his mechanical and chemical experiments. And the opposite side are a set of admirable drawings, and the other is filled with books and drawings as well. So he is collecting. I mean, this is less than probably his London house was, so it just gives you a sense of how much. The Wim house is now a care home. It's in Peeblesshire, so that's an image of it now. I wasn't able to find an older. And Inverary Castle is, of course, the home of the Argyles, but that was mostly not habitable, and it was something that when he became Duke in 1743, he began planning the building that is now there. And as he inherited, and even before there was a building to put things in, again, he was buying books in order to put inside that. So yeah, Wim and Inverary both had books, science and mathematics, among others, that he had there, and also laboratories. He was being a chemist and a botanist in these places, particularly the Wim, where he was experimenting with soils, he was experimenting with peat for fuel, he was interested in working out dyes, so he was working with lots of other chemists and practical people on all of that kinds of things as well. So we have some idea of the range of instruments that Ilay had from mentions. Again, Emerson has done huge amounts of work to bring all of this together. He had an orrery somewhat later. He had it certainly by 1745 by Thomas Wright, so one of those Fleet Street makers. And he starts to mention that he's selling a product like this and that the Duke of Argyll has one. So we know he acquired it. Alison Morrison-Lowe has been doing a lot of work to try and chase it down and where it went to after Ilay died. We think it ended up in, she thinks it ended up in a school and then sort of got used to pieces as happened. So I think sadly no longer there. Most of the objects don't survive, or they've been dispersed, and most of them clearly don't have his heraldry on them. I think that dial, my hunch is that he bought it quite early. He was making a real statement about who he was and the position he was gaining in the 1720s. And he's got his name splashed all over it. He's got one because the Tsar has got one and the Duke of Devonshire's got one and so on. Otherwise, and this is obviously also a library piece, a status piece, a demonstration piece. Otherwise, a lot of what he had was more hands-on, more practical things. He did actually make observations with his telescopes. He did actually tinker with his own clocks, as well as have people around him who could do that. These are a couple of pages from an inventory that is at Mount Stewart in Bute. And this is a list of instruments drawn up by the instrument maker, George Adams, of the instruments that were just in one place at one time that were going to be passed on to the Duke's nephew, who was the Earl of Bute, who became Prime Minister actually the year after that. So he was important in the court and at Westminster. And he was also very interested in instruments and books and so on. And he had to buy these because he wasn't the immediate heir, but he was interested enough that the clocks and the instruments he paid for and acquired, and also a lot of the library as well. This one includes our dial, as it says, an equinoctial dial by Glynn, 7-inch, and then below it, ditto, 18-inch, and ours is the larger one. I don't know what happened to the smaller one. We've not found that yet. But many other telescopes he had. He bought instruments from the sale of Samuel Molyneux, the astronomer, including a regulator and a telescope with a chair. He had an equatorial telescope. He had a short telescope and so on. So there is a lot in there. And he was a patron to many of these individuals. Alexander Wilson, for example, he essentially got into position as in a new chair of practical astronomy at Glasgow in 1760, but he'd long worked with Wilson as an instrument maker. He made and supplied things for him, and also as a chemist. They did lots of work together on dyes and things like that. Alexander Cumming is a name that you might know as a clockmaker. He made a wonderful barograph clock and there's one at Mount Stuart, there's one at the Science Museum. And he was from Inverary and seems to have been supported by Campbell's and probably by Ilay himself. Another instrument that we have in the museum is this little silver device. It's only about that size. When you open those rings out, it becomes a sphere. That keeps coordinates, has celestial coordinates and terrestrial coordinates. It's really beautiful. There are these tables of latitude so that you can use it as a sundial in different places as well. And one of the sites located there is Inverary. So the assumption is that connection. How many people in Inverary might have been likely to be able to afford and want an instrument like this? It was probably Ilay. It may be linked to someone like Cumming or possibly Glynn as well. We don't know. There is no signature on this one. So from Emerson and others, we've got this sense of the learned duke, the hands-on duke, the duke who is a patron to individuals for political reasons of all sorts, for family reasons, but also for reasons of thinking they are practical people, sensible people, intelligent people who will benefit the institutions they're part of. Something that I think Emerson hasn't fully pulled out, and I just want to sort of touch on it as I get towards the end of my talk, is the extent to which he was also connected to early Newtonians. So I say early, Newton had died by the time that this appeared. He died in 1727. But in terms of people interpreting and sharing and understanding Newton's work, it's still quite early. In terms of embedding Newtonian mathematics and Newtonian astronomy in universities and in public lectures and so on in London, it is quite early. And we can fit Ilay in with that group of people quite nicely. Very clearly from this, which I think is interesting. So this is a book by the experimental philosopher and lecturer, also a minister, John Theophilus de Zougulier. He was Huguenot, born in France, but lived in Britain, who lectured at Oxford, but then in London, very much to the court, to the Royal Society, did experiments for the Royal Society. He also lectured to people who could pay to come to a coffee house and hear a lecture. So he's part of that world of experimental philosophy I was alluding to earlier with the instrument makers and so on. He worked closely with them. And he produced this poem and dedicated it, interestingly, to the Earl of Ilay. So it's called The Newtonian System of the World, the Best Model for Government. It is an allegory of using Newtonian understanding of the universe and applying that to how we should run our government. It's published in 1728, was written in 1727, which of course is when Newton died, but also when we get the moment of succession from George I to George II. So it's this guarantee, in a sense, that Hanoverian settlement is going to continue on. It also relates, of course, to the Act of Union. So dedicating it to a Scottish politician makes a lot of sense. And someone like Ilay, who's so closely associated with this context. So he this is an idea of a law-driven, God-designed universe as a model is, sometimes painful, but the idea of liberty is brought in there, and rights and privileges. You've got a sort of a monarch in the center who exerts attraction but doesn't force. So he talks about that there is this kind of condemnation of Cartesianism built into this, which he calls physical romance, condemned in England but believed in France. For the bold Britons who all tyrants hate, in sciences as well as state, examined with experimental eyes the vortices of Cartesian skies, which tried by facts and mathematic test their inconsistent principles confessed. So basically, big up Newton and how he's kind of, got rid of all these imaginings of someone like Descartes, but also manages to twist this into an allegory for, he talks about guided, not enslaved, their orbits run the planets, and they attend their chiefs and respect the sun. So you can sort of get the picture, basically. But Ilay is right in there because he says, you are the sort of person, you understand laws, he is a lawyer, but also you are consummate, you understand the heavens, and so this poem is the right one for you. And we can actually put Desaguliers and Ilay very close together. It's very likely, we know that Ilay attended lectures by William Whiston, who was a slightly earlier lecturer, again, Newtonian kind of world, and he had copies, he made copies of his lectures. He undoubtedly would have attended some of Desaguliers as well. And he was very impressed by his publication, his translation of Gravestan's version of Newton's philosophy, which Desaguliers translated, and Ilay was recommending to people generally as an introduction to understanding Newtonianism. But he also brought Desaguliers up to Edinburgh at one point, so he invested in Desaguliers not just as a philosophical lecturer, but also as a mechanic. He was someone who was interested in improving steam engines and waterworks and all of that kind of thing. And he brought him up to Edinburgh, where his cousin was the provost at the time, to try and fix a problem in the Edinburgh water supply as well. So this kind of application of intelligence and science of a sort of, high sort being put into this very practical use is very typical, I think. And the closeness is clear from the fact that I haven't actually noted the date, I don't think, but 1721, the same year that Desaguliers came to Edinburgh, Ilay became godfather to his son, Thomas, who himself was a significant figure. He was chief firemaster at the Royal Arsenal later on. So they clearly were close, and a lot of, again, close contemporary in terms of dates, and someone he could clearly get on with. Just briefly kind of giving a sense of some of the other patronage. Both brothers were patrons to Colin Maclaurin, who people are probably familiar with. His memorial is in Greyfriars Kirk. Talks about him being proposed, being supported by Newton to get his chair of mathematics here in Edinburgh in 1725. But that's also something that Ilay would have been involved in and approved of. And the Campbells had long actually supported the family, but Maclaurin himself as well into his position. And because of Maclaurin, Edinburgh at that time became a really important centre for Newtonian ideas being disseminated. He's a really key figure. So again, we see Ilay's working through other people to actually make some quite significant change. He was also a subscriber to Henry Pemberton's view of Isaac Newton's philosophy. So again, getting that dissemination. This book is a slightly different beast, but I think it's interesting in terms of its backstory. It's a mathematician called Edmund Stone, who was a sort of autodidact mathematician and also linguist, and he translated a lot of text, mathematical texts, and also about instruments, such as this one. In 1723, this was dedicated to the second Duke, Ilay's brother, there's a story that he was found by the Duke in his garden. So he was close to the family. It seems to have been the son of the gardener to the Duke of Argyll. And the story is the Duke of Argyll came across him one day reading Principia at the age of 18, as you do if you're a gardener's son. And it was like, is that my copy? And he was going, no, it's mine. And he's like, so you understand the mathematics and the Latin? And he was saying, well, yes, I've learnt to read in your household. I've started to learn about instruments and mathematics from the architects that were building these houses that these brothers had. And then he was supported, at least for a period, by the family. What's interesting is that kind of the sense of the family as mathematical in general, and as Newton being sort of, common language amongst people there, as early as, say, 1718 or whatever, when that discussion took place. The dedication in 1723 talks about how the design of producing this translation was laid in your Grace's family. And I think that's interesting. That's not just the Duke. He's obviously dedicating it to the man who's in power, but he's also saying there's a wider context here. There's a lot of people within those households that are helping. So he says he was, a humbler retainer to your Grace, but in your family it was that I first caught an affection for mathematics. And what's interesting is that when that story is told, it's normally about the Duke of Argyll. Wrongly, he's sometimes said to be an Inverary, a Scottish mathematician. I don't think it was. This would have been in one of those estates near Richmond. But the story is told, mentioned by Voltaire as well in the 1730s. And he says it was Ilay who came across him and saw him reading Principia and then supported him. So he talks about, he made a great philosopher of him. And it's interesting that he says he may have just got the wrong brother, but I think that stuff about your family says, this is happening together. And also Voltaire was in London and friendly with Desaguliers, probably met Ilay. He was there in 1726 to 28, which was the year after Desaguliers had nominated Stone as a Fellow of the Royal Society. So it's not, maybe he actually knew better, and that story. So I'm not quite sure which way it is being twisted, but as I say, tells us that Newtonianism was part of the Argyll setup for the families. Just briefly, we've got another nice connection to astronomy. This is a plate that's dedicated to Archibald Campbell when he's Duke of Argyll, from an atlas, a celestial atlas by John Bevis that never quite saw the light of day. He's associated here with I don't even know how to say it, Auriga, is that right? The charioteer. But what's interesting is he's often identified with another figure who was the son of the equivalent of Vulcan in the Greek mythology and raised by Athena, which would be very appropriate as a sort of goddess of wisdom, but also kind of military and so on for Argyll and his interest. But Bevis, again, was an early Newtonian, and many of the other dedicatees of these plates we can also associate with that as well, like Maupertuis, who was trying to champion Newtonianism in France over Cartesianism. So there's that link again. So just to conclude, for Emerson, he says, well, many things about Ilay and the kinds of impact he had, but he is keen to see him as the enlightened Duke. And he says that in many ways, the Scottish Enlightenment was the lengthened shadow of this man and of the men that he helped to place in Scotland. So that includes Wilson and Maclaurin and some of the others that I mentioned, but also other figures as well. So he's talking about the impact in Scotland, but there's also a link in England because, of course, he spent a lot of his time in Westminster and around the court as well. And there is this link to Bute, who, as I mentioned, acquired a lot of those instruments afterwards. And Bute is the one who oversaw the education of George III, or as the prince, as he was, and his brother, the Prince of Wales, Prince Frederick, who died before he could become king. And he is the one who made sure they were reading things like Gravesand's version of Newton. They were the ones getting the equivalent set of instruments, getting demonstrations from Stephen de Membray, who was retained by the court to display not just sort of beautiful instruments like this, but also all those kind of mechanical principles, understanding curves, understanding movement, all of these kinds of things. So through Bute, there is the creation of what we now call the George III collection, which is at the Science Museum on loan from King's College, London. And it is the equivalent, I think, of the kind of thing that Ilay, at a somewhat earlier period, was amassing for himself, although he clearly hands-on in a way that perhaps the princes never quite were. And also there's still that connection to morality and to good politics and how to be a good ruler. So again, he's very much that stuff that comes in that Desugulia poem, that allegory. Newtonianism is meant to be a model for how you manage yourself and manage your kingdom, as well as how you understand the world. So do go and see the object. Just to give you a horrible picture of me, but just to give you a sense of the size of it, it's not a little thing like this. It is quite impressive. So if you go and have a look at it in the gallery, I hope it will draw your eye and encourage you to look around. Thank you.
Thank you. Definitely have to go and see that.
Yes.
Did I hear you right? You called it Bling?
Bling, yeah, absolutely.
You heard
yes,
it here first. The NMS have Bling.
It was not the anniversary of the transit of Venus, but it's a sort of Christmas bling kind of story, yes.
Okay. Do we have any questions? Graham, microphone.
I've got a couple of points. You mentioned multiple copies of Euclid.
Yes.
Do you happen to know, my favourite's the one with John Dee's preface. Do you happen to know if that was included in his collection?
I'm afraid I don't. You'd have to go to Emerson and look up. So he's there is a catalogue, and he's done lots of work to recreate as much as he can from what
The other one was one of the preface of, well, the frontispiece of one of the books mentioned Rowley's orrery machine. Does that still exist?
So that, there's mention of the horary, I think they call it. So that the original Rowley orrery is now at the Science Museum, and it sort of is associated with that George III collection, although it's got a slightly earlier prehistory. But I think that's the earliest one that we've got is there. Yes.
And a third point, I'm going to be greedy. You pointed out the amount of influence the family, in particular, in its larger form, had over getting Newtonianism taught and understood in Scotland, especially in Edinburgh. Mm. Did they have any similar influence with the two smaller universities in England?
Yes. I mean, he didn't always get his own way in terms of who was placed, and there were other interests and, factionalism, even within the Whig Party, you've got lots of sort of different interests and so on, and he didn't always get who he wanted in. But I think, someone like Alexander Wilson, he got placed in Glasgow, and there were instruments there. Gregory is at St Andrews a little bit earlier. I think that's sort of not necessarily his say-so, but I think it's particularly clear in Edinburgh, but Scotland already had this, a very different kind of university set up to England. So there were people, there were these kind of chairs that were teaching practical things like chemistry and astronomy and so on. But I think Wilson and Maclaurin, I think, are the two more obvious people that you put in place. The fingers in all the pies. I didn't mention the medical school in Edinburgh is something that Emerson also associates with him, although somewhat sort of behind the scenes.
Can I ask a question? So, call it Bling. It's clearly a very nice toy as well. Was it actually a serious scientific instrument? Did he actually do any serious science? Is clearly a serious scientist and must have recorded all this stuff. Is there much information about what he did with it? Yes, we don't, amazingly, given how important he was, there isn't really an archive belonging to him. I think because he died without direct heirs, things got split up very much. The dukedom passed on and the estate passed on, but his personal belongings got dispersed, including his papers. So we've got, Emerson does a great job at trying to rebuild all of this, and there are some observations, I think, with the telescope. He was a very busy man. I don't think he had time to do a long series of observations. He probably had people to do things for him as well. So something like this instrument, it is an accurate way of finding out the time. Not as accurate as perhaps doing a whole series of transit observations, but if you want to set your clocks, and he did have good clocks, he was very interested in clocks, he had regulators. If you want to set those, this would do the job
for that. So it might be him, it might be someone else he was working with doing that. I think also it's this demonstration thing. I mean, the fact that you could use that to say, this is where the sun is on the other side of the world, or this is what time the sun would set at this time of year. So you can use it like something like an armillary sphere or an orrery in terms of that kind of demonstration, prediction, kind of understanding of motions, as much as you might use it. So I imagine it would have been kept indoors mostly. You could move it to a window if it's south-facing. Your servant might take it outside for you to get a reading, but we don't have. And sadly, there aren't obvious sort of patterns of wear that we can, and it's had such a long history, it's very difficult to know. After it went to Butte, it got sold and I think acquired by someone in the Society of Antiquaries, the Secretary of the Society of Antiquaries, and then I don't know what happened to it after that until it turned up in the 1960s. So long history. I imagine mostly it was like you can imagine a globe or something in your library. It's there to show off rather than to be used.
Yeah. Okay. On here? Yep.
Hello. So do they think that it was built to his directions or just something he saw and liked?
That's a good question. I saw and liked because being made for, I imagine he was the kind of person who went to instrument makers' shops and talked to the people there. I mean, we know that interested people did. They were quite sociable spaces and places where you could buy books, which he loved, as well as instruments and so on. So I imagine he saw, one being made for the Tsar or something like that, and it's like, I want one of those with my name on it. But it's made to his design to the extent that it's got his monogram and his, and the fact that it's so much bigger as well. There isn't another one, all the other ones are sort of this size, and this one is, it's like, I want one of those and twice or more the size, which I think is I think it fits very well with the kind of things that Glyn did as well, and the fact that he was interested in scale and he's interested in about, as I say, this sort of connection between time and the movement of the sun and all this sort of thing in a very visual way. The way he designed his instruments is quite distinct, and I can imagine they talked about it and thought about what happens if we make it really look like it's and also I like the fact that his monogram is in the middle, so he's essentially put himself in the position of, well, the sun, if it's a sort of heliocentric, or the earth, and everything is revolving around him. So if we think again of that sort of Newtonian allegory, AC, the Earl is the person that everything is revolving around. I imagine they enjoyed talking through all of that.
Any other questions in here? Is there anything on Zoom, on YouTube?
Yeah, Francis, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
To just get to the... Just ask the question.
Maybe I'll just ask it. It was just a question of whether you were able to tell us how much the museum had paid for the beautiful instrument at the start of the talk.
I think it is a matter of public record. So it wasn't, the museum, this was a question of fundraising, so I should thank the museum's charitable trust, but also the Art Fund and the National Heritage Memorial Fund and some private donors. So that tells you we're talking quite big money. We had to do all of this. And I think it is a matter of public record, so I can tell you that it was £750,000, which is quite a lot of money. Not much if you're talking, Van Goghs and Leonardos and things like that, but for a scientific instrument, it has been a record breaker in the past. I think for a historic instrument, when it was sold in 1999, I think it broke records, actually, and in 69. So yes, not cheap, but I hope worth it. It's fantastic to have it as part of the National Collection now, thanks to all of that.
And Pat, can you unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me. I was just wondering, did you need to do any work on it, any restoration work when you bought it?
Yes, good question. So my colleagues in conservation did largely cleaning works, and particularly removing of Brasso. It seems to have been dipped and dunked at various points and came in with just so much, like in all those, little filigree places, sort of chunks of Brasso in there. So just cleaning it really brought it to life. It's not, it does still function. It's some of the teeth in the main meridian ring, so that's when you're adjusting the latitude. Some of those have broken off over time, but we're not sort of repairing it. You can still move it within certain sections. You might not be able to revolve it all the way around. Other parts of it, I think the base, you can no longer make that adjustment for the difference between magnetic and north and astronomical north in a simple way. You can move the thing, but you can't do the little fine adjustment and things like that. Because it's had this long history that we don't know about, it was owned since '69. It's been parts of collections of people who are particularly interested in clocks rather than astronomy, and it's not a clock, and I think it's not been their favourite item as a result, although they each pay quite a lot of money to have it. It's not necessarily the prized thing, so I think it's been slightly overlooked, apart from by people who are instrument curators interested in mathematical instruments and sundials and so on, and they've got very, very excited about it. But I think that tells you something about the Brasso and so on. I think quite a lot of the silver that was on the scales originally has been worn so thin you can't quite see that now. So if it were a piece for a private house, you might want to have it resilvered, but we won't be doing that as part of the museum. It still shines very nicely without.
Is that it? That's you.
Oh, I should say we have done some XRF analysis on it lately as well, which just to kind of find out more about the composition of the instrument and compare it to other things of the same date and try and get a sense of whether some parts might have been replaced later in its history, which I think is probably quite likely. I think the sighting vane has been replaced, for example. It does tell us that the silver parts are definitely sterling silver, and the other parts are, particularly the parts that we know Glynn himself would have worked on, which are these very accurately divided scales, have got really exquisite engraving on them, which some of the decoration less so. It's not mathematical in the same way as the scales have to be so precise, and those are very much typical brass of that early 18th century period, so equivalent of other instruments. So hopefully all of that will be written up at some point as well.
Actually, Ramsey has a follow-up question. I don't know if you want to ask your question, Ramsey.
I don't know if you can hear me or not.
Yep.
Yes, we can.
Yeah. While the Brasso has been removed and cleaned off, how do you stop it tarnishing further?
I'm not a conservator, so I don't fully know. There is a kind of lacquer I think you can put on. So lacquer done not professionally can be problematic, and it sort of changes colour and so on. But I think this is just a very light protective layer that gets used. So and we will be much more careful in terms of handling and so on. It had fingerprints all over it from dealers or owners or whoever had been in touch with it, and it is now obviously in a case and much more protected from that.
Okay, well, thank you very much again, Rebekah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, now it's going to be over to Jim, who's going to tell us about the sky in December. There, yeah.
Okay. All right. So the sky in December. After a few of these presentations in spring or summer, I finally get the chance to present one when there's plenty of darkness. In fact, the month with the longest nights. It's hard to predict weather-wise whether we'll have any favourable conditions, though. I did put here, tomorrow evening might be clear, and then check, and actually it looks maybe now, it's not going to be clear. So we can keep our fingers crossed. As usual, the presentation has a few images from the Society's Flickr group sprinkled throughout, and illustrating a few of the objects which are visible this month. We'll start with the times. I've included the 21st of December here for the winter solstice, and only 6 hours, 57 minutes and 36 seconds of daylight, which is 10 2/3 hours less daylight on the longest day, which we all will know. For those who like times, the sun's exactly overhead at 10:20 UT on that day. And although 21st of December is the shortest day, it doesn't have the earliest sunset and latest sunrise. They are on 14th and 28th December, respectively. And that's because of the Earth's elliptical orbit and tilted axis. It doesn't mean you have the shortest day with the latest sunrise and earliest sunset. You will notice that the sunset time hardly varies between now and the solstice, before starting to rapidly get later by the month end, with the opposite happening with the sunrise. I think unlike the summer solstice, I think the fact that we're up and about at sunrise and sunset means that we're more acutely aware of changes in the light and darkness at this time of year. I've always thought that these change ever so slowly over the months of December, January and February. So on to the moon, and from tonight, the first event I've noted is first quarter on the 8th of December. And we have new moon at the end of the month. We actually had new moon on the 1st of December as well. And because the lunar month is around 29.5 days long, there are several times when the calendar months will be longer, so you end up with 2 new moons and other phases too. It happens about every 29 months. So the next one will be in August 2027. The full moon is on 15th of December, and it's called the cold moon. Well, there's a surprise. It's likely that temperatures will be lower at this time of year. It's also known in some cultures as the long night's moon. Again, no surprise. Or the moon before Yule. Yeah, there's another thought. It's Christmas coming up. We do have this month a once in an 18.6 years event. So the full moon on 15th of December will see the moon rising and setting at its most northerly points on the horizon during its 18.6 year lunar precession cycle. So that's something to watch out for, no doubt. And I've noted, but we'll come to it later, around first quarter, the moon will be close to Saturn. So we'll see about that a bit later on. So turning to the planets, Mercury is not visible this month, so no point looking there. Venus, it sets 1850, so the sun will have set, but it is getting low in the sky as evening progresses, and its highest point is only 10 degrees in altitude, but its magnitude means that it should be visible in late in the day as well, in daylight. So you may see Venus, but it's not the best. However, Mars has excellent visibility this month. It rises about 3.5 hours after sunset, reaches an altitude of 55 degrees, about 4 o'clock in the morning, and can be seen until sunrise. Jupiter also has excellent visibility this month. Again, it's rising around sunset, setting around sunrise, also around 55 degrees. And it will be at opposition tomorrow, although cloudy weather might put paid to any observations of that. Saturn doesn't have quite such good visibility as it's getting lower in the sky after sunset. It sets at just after 11 p.m. So there should be opportunity to see it when it has got dark. But early evening is probably your best bet to try for seeing Saturn. And Uranus and Neptune are both visible, although obviously they're sort of less bright objects, meaning that you probably need binoculars or a telescope to see them. All right. A few comets, and I'll refer people to the Society's website for the In the Sky notes, which are now being published. And Douglas Heggie has added some comments about a couple of comets. 33P Linear, which is predicted to reach magnitude 10 by the end of the year, currently visible near Leo, and also notes about 29P, let's just pronounce it probably wrong, Schwarzmann-Wachmann, which is rising before midnight close to Regulus with a magnitude of about 12 in a period of high activity. And I've included here Peter Black's image of comet C2023A3 Tushinshan Atlas, which has been in our notes for a few months, still visible but fading rapidly. Now, this month also sees a meteor shower, the Geminids, which actually has already started. It's active until the 17th of the month. The peak is on the 14th, but that's just one day from full moon, so it will be a challenge. The radiant point where meteors will appear to emanate from is near the star Castor in Gemini. And under peak conditions, it's estimated the zenithal hourly rate's about 120, but as I say, obviously we've not got peak conditions this year with the moon. Now, on to the star charts. Now, the first one, I don't know whether this shows anything which is actually in the sky in December, but it is quite historic. And I think its longevity even exceeds that of Alan Pickup's 50 years of star charts. This is the oldest known star chart from any civilization. It dates from around AD 649 to 700, and it was found in the Mogao caves near the ancient town of Dunhuang in western China, which was once a major junction on the Silk Roads. And the depictions on the scroll, this is just a part of it, have about 1,350 stars visible across 13 maps. And I saw this in October when the British Library had a little exhibition on the Silk Road. And I thought it was quite an interesting thing to see, but not very good for trying to see what's in the sky this month, I don't think. I've timed the the charts for just after the meeting tonight, although those who braved the weather to come out here tonight will know that we're not likely to see anything in the sky this evening. However, fingers crossed, it might get a bit better later in the week. So looking north, there's not a lot of sort of specific objects in the north to highlight, but it's always worth noting the constellation of Ursa Minor and the pulsar Polaris. It's a good starting point for orientationing in the sky, given the relatively simple and distinctive configuration. And next door, almost, is Ursa Major, hosting a number of deep sky objects, 6 from the Messier catalogue and several galaxies in the NGC, which means it's certainly a happy place for society's imagers. So I've sort of highlighted a couple of photographs from that area. Nigel's one from November, and David's from the beginning of the year. Looking east, there's maybe a bit more to see this time of year. There's always the welcome sign of Orion appearing with its prominent stars Betelgeuse and Rigel, and the nebula just below the belt. And following the belt down, we see the brightest star in the night sky, Sirius, at magnitude -1.1, rising just at the time of the chart, although it becomes much more prominent later in the evening. We can also see Mars visible low down, almost due east in the constellation of Cancer, magnitude -0.6. And between Mars and Sirius, we'll find the star Procyon in Canis Minor. At a distance 11.5 light years, it's the 8th brightest star in the night sky of magnitude 0.3, and is actually a binary system. The star we see in the sky is Procyon A, which is orbited by a white dwarf, Procyon B, magnitude 10.7, and there's an average separation of just under the distance from the Sun to Uranus. And above Orion, it's hard not to miss Jupiter, which is in excellent position for observation, high in the sky, and magnitude -2.66, ahead of opposition tomorrow. And looking slightly higher, we come to the Pleiades, always a favorite target for observers. Part of the Messier catalogue M45, and more than 1,000 stars in this cluster, about 444 light years away, which has played an important role in calibrating astronomical distances in stellar evolution. And then quite close to the Pleiades, any ambitious observers can look for Uranus. As I said earlier, it's going to be a little bit of a challenge, particularly in a light polluted sky. And given so much talk of the planets, I picked out a couple of recent planetary images to illustrate our eastwards view, which have just recently appeared on our Flickr pages. Turning our attention towards the south, there isn't quite as much interest, although of course the southeasterly direction does cover some of the things I've just been talking about. Almost due south at this time is the constellation of Orion, and just next door is the constellation of Pisces. And I thought it was quite entertaining, Stellarium's artistry, which shows how you can get more or less two straight lines as a ram and two fish. I think you need quite a bit of imagination for that. The three brightest stars in Aries run along the what you might term the back of the ram, which are 41 Arrhetius, magnitude 3.6, which is a triple star system, and Hamal, the brightest at magnitude 2, and then Sheraton at magnitude 2.6, marking one of the horns, which is a binary system, although it took a stellar interferometer at Mount Wilson to resolve the two stars because it couldn't be seen through a conventional telescope. Pisces is a large constellation, although there are not very many prominent stars, and there are actually only two brighter than fourth magnitude, one in each of the fish. But there are deep sky objects in Pisces, and Nigel had imaged M74 in 2020. Finally, looking to the western part of the sky, we've got a couple of prominent objects. Low down near the horizon is Saturn in the constellation of Aquarius, magnitude 1, and in the constellation of Lyra, Vega, magnitude 0.1, which is the fifth brightest star in the night sky. Nearby to Lyra is the constellation of Cygnus, with its bright star Deneb, magnitude 1.3, which forms the top of the asterism in this constellation known as the Northern Cross. And Deneb is also part of another asterism, the well-known Summer Triangle, formed with Vega and Altair. It seems a bit strange to be talking about the Summer Triangle in December, but it might just be visible if you have a clear view to the western horizon, although you need to make an early observation as Altair sets at 21:59. There are a couple of second and third magnitude stars in Cygnus, including Albireo, a binary system which has been imaged by a number of members, highlighting the yellow and blue colors of the two stars. The constellation also includes a number of other interesting features, which have also been the subject of images from members. And mentioning the North American nebula is a good reminder about the Society's Caldwell project to image objects in the Caldwell catalogue. And we have a dedicated part of our website highlighting these images. It started in March 2021, and there are now images of 50 of the 65 objects you can see from the UK on the website. And jumping the chart forward a couple of days to 10 o'clock on the 8th of December, we can see that the Moon and Saturn will be relatively close in the sky. The closest they will appear to get is 18.7 arc minutes. And I'm sure some of our astrophotographers would be giving this a go, provided, of course, we have some decent weather to play ball, which will need a lot of fingers to be crossed, I think, for that to happen. And I think that is the last of my slides. So there we have it.
Thank you, Jim. I'm glad that you said that the sun will be directly overhead on the 21st of December, so I'm looking forward to a bit of warmth then. That'll be good. I think you meant due south maybe, but overhead will be good for me. That's it for tonight. Thank you everyone for coming and everyone online as well. It's tea and coffee afterwards. Thank you to Peter as always for doing that. We do need to be out of here before 10 o'clock, please. But thank you for coming and see you next month.